Well, John, Patrick Carney, thank you for doing the Plunderbund interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, you decided to run for auditor, and your campaign is built on three main pillars: creating jobs, bringing transparency back to state government, building strong communities. How did you come to these three pillars, issues, and can you talk a little bit about them, and if possible, give any examples of those three?
Sure. Well, I think a big part of what government is supposed to be doing is providing opportunity to people through the use of their own resources. And so when we talk about building strong communities, from my perspective, the auditor is the chief inspector of the state, which means the auditor is supposed to make sure that your tax money, your land, your water, your public resources are being used to your best interest. And frankly, that means that you need to be able to see how those assets are being used in order to determine whether or not they're being used for your best interest. And from my perspective, when I got elected to state representative, I thought evidence-based ideas would create bipartisanship. Alas, gerrymandered legislative districts have kept people from making choices based upon evidence-based ideas. But I'm the product of K through law school public education as the 11th to 12 kids, but for the generous investment of the public in strong communities and schools and things like that go I. And so, I really think that when we think about the history of the United States, it's been our collective investment in each other that has given the United States and the people of the United States its opportunity. And so, in order to facilitate that, I think you need a strong auditor who's pulling the curtains back, saying, this is how we're spending your money, whether it be on schools or local infrastructure, and this is what you're getting for it. And then the public can decide whether or not they think their elected officials are making good choices with their money. And so I think when we talk about the themes of the campaign, really it's about empowering the public to understand what they're getting for their money and deciding whether or not the elected officials are making the right choice. And frankly, when the Constitution of the state was drafted, nobody anticipated that you'd have to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, to run for office, and how that might influence elected officials and the way that they spend your money. Well, I think the state auditor should be showing this is where your elected officials have gotten their campaign money, and then this is where they voted to use your money and use your assets. And it should be very clear kind of where the campaign cash is coming from and then where the people's money is going. And as auditor, I'm going to make sure that people have an understanding of what's coming back to my community. Is it making my community stronger? Is it giving me and my family opportunity and our ability to live our own American dream? And so, these are really kind of themes that I think all of us in government should be focused on, whether or not we're creating strong communities, whether or not we're acting in a transparent way, showing what we're doing. And so, as an auditor, I plan to make sure that I emphasize those ideas.
Now then, you talked about preventing the misuse of tax dollars in order to protect Ohio's students, families, and taxpayers, and that's a priority for you. Can you talk a little more about that? Give some details, and if you can, an example or two.
Sure. So, just as the last budget, over $500 million were essentially transferred from A-rated public schools to failing charter schools here in the state. I'm a supporter of good education, good schools, and frankly, because somebody like David Brennan, the operator of White Hat Management, has given $2.5 million in contributions, it appears he's gotten over $1 billion in tax money to run schools that have a 35% or lower graduation rate. Well, that's just not sound public policy. And frankly, when people go out to the ballot and vote property tax increases on themselves, they expect that the money is going to be used wisely. And so, again, the auditor should be showing this is your money, this is how it's being spent. By the way, some of the folks who are receiving that money have made campaign contributions, and you should understand, all right, well, this is the campaign contributions they made, and this is what they're doing for the state and for the taxpayers of the state. Another example, guy in the legislature who bottles water for Culligan for a living wrote legislation to allow anyone in the state, person, company, anyone, on a day-to-day basis without a permit to draw over 3 million gallons of water from your lakes, rivers, and streams. Go out to California or New Mexico or Arizona and ask them how much 3 million gallons of water costs on a day-to-day basis from their reservoirs or lakes or streams. You're not getting it for free, and certainly they're not allowing people to draw that water without having oversight. Here in the state, agriculture is your #1 business. If you're a farmer in the state, I'd be concerned if individuals or businesses are able to draw 3 million gallons of water a day without any permit, without any oversight, without paying anything to the state. Again, I think the taxpayers are being robbed, quite frankly. And I think, in part, not only because you've got a guy who bottles water for a living, but because oil and natural gas companies decided they wanted free access to our water, and a bunch of legislators and executive office holders got campaign checks. They decided to say, hey, yeah, go ahead, take our water. And frankly, I think that's one of the greatest assets the taxpayers have. Fresh water, whether it's for agriculture, whether you're running a brewery or there's so many businesses that require water to operate that we should be safeguarding that resource, and the public should know what they're getting for it. And so, those are the sorts of things that, as auditor, I plan to make sure that the public has, real transparency with respect to what's happening with those assets.
In your answer early on, you talked about charter schools. Very controversial issue. It appears that Ohio may be spending upwards of $900 million over the biennium on charter schools. Should you be elected auditor, what would you do differently than Auditor Yost has done on that whole topic?
Well, the Constitution and, statute is very clear in the state that the auditor is the chief inspector. And so the auditor is supposed to follow every public dime that's spent, whether it's being spent by a public entity or if it's spent by a private entity or a private board. And so all the tricks and ways that they've tried to hide our public money as it passes into these charter schools, unfortunately, I think we've had some elected office holders who have been complicit in allowing them to hide our assets. And so that's just not what I'm going to do as auditor. I think it's my obligation and responsibility to follow every dime. If you've got an operator like David Brennan at White Hat Management who's saying that the assets he buys with public money at the beginning of the year becomes a private asset at the end of the year, and you can't see how much money is going into my pocket and how much I spent on educating these kids versus how much windfall profit I walked away. I disagree. I think it's very clear that it is the auditor's responsibility to be following this money, to show the public how it's being used, and if it's going into somebody's pocket as profit, or if they're purchasing public assets and they're converting that to private property at the end of the year, there should be an accounting of all those assets. And so, I just don't think that the auditor should stop. I mean, my opponent has said that the legislature, in passing a statute saying he can't look at Jobs Ohio, he's saying let's take a wait-and-see approach as to how it works. Well, again, I think he's forfeiting his responsibility as auditor. Without liquor profits, there's no sale of bonds to then have Jobs Ohio, which means but for the public asset, there is no Jobs Ohio. There's no private board. And so it's the auditor's job, constitutionally, to follow this money, show the public where it's being spent, whether the businesses that are getting it are following through with creating the jobs they've promised and putting up their private money. And the fact that it went into the hands of a private board doesn't short-circuit the auditor's obligation and responsibility. And I find it laughable that the legislature would say, we've got the power to pass laws to tell the chief inspector he can't look at things that he's supposed to look at by Constitution. If they want to change that, they need to amend the Constitution of the state of Ohio. They can't pass statutes and say the check on us can't check us anymore, which is essentially what the legislature and the governor are saying is we don't want the auditor to look at what we're doing, and the auditor is saying, okay, I won't look at it. Well, that's not your right to say I'm not going to look at it. It's your right to say I have to look at it because that's the job I was elected to do, and the Constitution of the state tells me that's what I have to do. And in fact, I will bring a lawsuit saying it's my responsibility to look at this, and it's the obligation of the legislature, the Jobs Ohio board, the governor to turn all documents over to me so that I can analyze them and give that information back to the taxpayers.
great lead into the next question. Given the constitutional powers vested in the auditor, and should you be elected auditor, are you prepared to test the constitutional powers of the office by exercising your authority in a way that maybe takes you places that other people say, oh no, you shouldn't go there? Are you ready to challenge them and maybe challenge the Constitution, or push the envelope on the Constitution and what you can do as an executive?
Yeah, I mean, again, as an elected official, I work for the taxpayers. Whether it's a state representative or, as auditor, I will work for the taxpayers, which means that the money at the disposal of the legislature and the governor, the public lands, the public water, etc., all of those are assets, and I'm not doing my job if I'm not doing everything to follow all those assets and then give a comprehensive report back to the taxpayers. And so I think that, frankly, we haven't had anybody in that office who will act the way that I act, which is ultimately, I don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent. It's my job to see how you're spending money, how you're using public assets, and then turn to the public and without any sort of loyalty to politics say, this is what I've seen, and now it's your choice to make decisions on whether or not you think the people in those offices who have the authority to spend the money and use those assets are making good choices. And so, to me, I just feel like this office has been underutilized for a long time, and there's been a lot of, well, we're just going to do the typical audit and show as little as we need to. Well, that's not going to be my approach. I think there's a lot of concern by taxpayers and all the people of the state. They're not getting their value out of government, that elected officials aren't working for them any longer, and it's my job to make sure that they have the ability to at least try to get their elected officials to start working for them again.
Great. As a sitting member of the legislature, you've had an opportunity to go through the budgeting process. So we're assuming you're familiar with the auditors, the numbers and dollars allocated to the auditor's office. Do you think they're enough to do what you want to do? Would you increase them? Can you reduce the expenditures? Or do you want to just sort of jigger around what you do within the same fixed budget that the auditor is operating under currently?
Yeah, well, there hasn't been a Democrat in the auditor's office since the beginning of the 1980s. And so, my sense is there needs to be a top-to-bottom review of what the office has been doing, what the individuals have been doing in the office, and whether or not there's additional capacity within the budget constraints that are already there to do more. That being said, I think I have good relationships with members of the General Assembly on both sides, and it's in their best interest to have somebody who is checking what is happening with dollars. Certainly, Republican rhetoric says that they want government accountability. They're suspect of government, and so arguably they should want a robust auditor's office that's going through every dollar with a fine-tooth comb. And so I think, certainly at this point it's premature to say whether or not I would need additional dollars to do the job. My sense is that there is, within the budget that's there, money to do what needs to be done, and frankly we just need people to be aggressive about pursuing what their responsibility is.
As a member of the legislature, you've obviously been involved in lots of bipartisan efforts and reached out to the other side of the aisle. It's maybe fair to say that the Senate won't revert to a Democratic control this year, since it hasn't since 1984. The House could very well still be in control of controlled by Republicans come January 1st next year. If you're forced to face a GOP-controlled legislature, how will you reach out to them as a lawmaker, knowing how things work there? How will you reach out to them? How will you reach common ground and still achieve what the major goals that you've already talked about for the office?
Sure. Well, when I got elected, I thought evidence-based policies would create bipartisanship. I've been a healthcare attorney for 13 years. I put physician practices together. Certainly the way that physicians and medicine works is based upon evidence-based policies, and I think that's exactly what government should be doing, is pursuing evidence-based policies. And I will continue to do that in my role role as state auditor, and over 90% of the bills I've introduced in the General Assembly have had broad bipartisan support, and so I have a track record of working in a bipartisan way with the legislature, and so I will continue to endeavor to do that. That being said, I do think that as an apportionment board officer, I will push for a constitutional amendment to redraw legislative lines to give us the majority of House, Senate, and congressional districts, to have them be competitive so that political lines essentially align with the idea of compromise and pragmatism and working together. Because right now the majority of districts are drawn to either be very right-wing districts or very left-wing districts in a system of democracy that's based upon compromise. And so, there's a lot of people who ask me, well, why can't people work together? Is it that you guys don't drink beer together, or you don't know each other's families? And I always tell them, there's plenty of alcohol being drank by the members of the General Assembly. What we need is districts that are such that you've got to go out and campaign to people on both sides of the political aisle, and in fact you are encouraged to get things done together. I mean, the district that I got elected to in the legislature for the first time hadn't had a Democrat in 25 years when I got elected, and in 2010 all the Democrats lost except for me, and it was because I was out there telling my constituents, look, I reached across the aisle. The vast majority of my bills, over 90%, had broad bipartisan support on trying to work together to get things done. And I got rewarded politically by getting reelected. And I think that we need more of those districts where we have people both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party who say, it's the right thing to do, and by the way, politically, it's in my best interest of getting reelected if I work with these people on the other side. And I just think common sense needs to start prevailing. We need less partisanship and more pragmatism, and people to start acting like adults instead of children in elected office.
Given what you've said so far about what your campaign is based on and what you want to do, where has David Yost failed the most so far in not doing what you would do if you had been in his position? And do you attribute that to just his ability to run the office properly, or his management skills, or is it more of a political calculation that, oh, I can't do that because I'm going to hurt somebody in my party, or my party's going to be angry at me, so I want to sort of like maintain a hands-off approach to whatever the issue may be.
Yeah, well, I mean, he supported drawing the legislative districts that we are stuck with right now as a starting point. And, for anybody who's frustrated by the inability of your elected officials to work together here in the state and be thoughtful and pragmatic, the governor, the auditor, and the Secretary of State are the three constitutional apportionment board officers. They all supported these very gerrymandered districts that frankly don't support general elections where we get people with common sense. And so obviously I think that was a very bad choice by my opponent. And frankly I think it undermines our ability to just do the work of government because we've got a lot of partisans and not pragmatic people. I give him credit that I wrote him a letter that said you have to audit Jobs Ohio, and the next day he came out and said I have to audit Jobs Ohio. So he took good advice from me, and I appreciated that. Unfortunately, he then did not follow through with actually doing what he was supposed to do. And when he came out and said, oh, we've audited Jobs Ohio, he hadn't run a financial audit, and then he said, oh, well, we did a haphazard review of conflicts policy of Jobs Ohio. Well, a haphazard review of the conflicts policy didn't make sense because 6 of the 9 board members we knew had questionable conflicts of interest, so you didn't want to haphazardly look at them. You wanted to specifically look at these conflicts and see whether or not the conflict of interest policy of Jobs Ohio was followed when grants were given to the companies or universities or interests that these folks on the boards represented, which he did not do. And, as a corporate attorney, the conflict of interest policy says if you sit on a board and your company or the entity you represent is going to benefit, well, you've got to disclose that to everyone on the board, and then you can't participate in the conversation about whether or not they get it. And by the way, if we find something of equal value or greater value, we've got to go with that instead of with the one that's going to benefit our board member. And what did Jobs Ohio say? We've never invoked our conflict of interest policy. Well, that's a problem then, Mr. Yost, because 6 of the 9 board members indicate that they got some grant or benefit out of Jobs Ohio. And so it's discouraging to me then that on top of it, a piece of legislation passes that says you can no longer look at this, and he goes on television the next day and says, oh, well, there's nothing I can do now. The legislature passed legislation that says I can't look at this anymore. To which I wrote him a letter and said, well, Auditor, actually, legislation takes 90 days to become effective if there's not an appropriation in it. So at a minimum, you've got 90 days, and arguably, the legislature can't say we want to keep the people who are supposed to have oversight of us from having oversight of us. I mean, that is the balance of power and the checks and balances that the framers of the Constitution put in place. So arguably, you can't upset the Constitution by passing a piece of legislation, something else that a lawyer should know, which Mr. Yost is. And so I think it's just discouraging that somebody who, frankly, put himself out there saying, I'm so interested in bringing transparency and accountability, I'm going to take on my own party, then says, oh, well, actually, I'm really not interested. I'm interested in looking the part, but not actually doing the part. And we need more people to be less about talking the talk and more about walking the walk. And that's what I plan to do.
This is a midterm election year. And as history has shown, voter turnout drops off significantly, sometimes 30 or 40% from what it is in presidential elections, and it's nothing to really crow about worldwide in presidential election years.
Sure.
Do you have any reservations about your electability in a year when it may turn out to be another 2010, when at that point, Governor Kasich only got 49% of a 49% voter turnout, and he won by 77,127 votes statewide, 2% over former Governor Ted Strickland. Is your campaign prepared to weather the poor performance in voter turnout this year? And do you have any reservations about that, or you'll persevere regardless?
Well, certainly we want to do all that we can, and I can do personally, to get Democratic voters to turn out. There's just a lot more registered Democrats in the state of Ohio generally than there are Republicans, and we want to encourage them to turn out because, certainly when it comes to basic core principles, we agree, and we want them to turn out. That being said, this campaign isn't just about campaigning to Democrats. It's about campaigning to the reasonable folks of Ohio. And if you're a voter, I'm out there campaigning to you. I don't care what your political stripes are. My whole career in politics has been built on having people on both sides of the aisle say, this guy's common sense, this guy's reasonable, he's working on evidence-based policies, that's what I want, and that's why I'm supporting him. And so I think regardless of what the turnout is, provided we can get our message out to the voters of the state who do make up the actual voting electorate this campaign year, that I will win this election. And so I think that is what I've endeavored to do. I've traveled over 50,000 miles around Ohio over the last year and tried to meet with as many people as possible. And frankly, I'm trying to get into Rotary clubs or Kiwanis or women's clubs or whatever they are, bipartisan organizations, to talk about why this matters and why a job that people don't know about matters to them. And so, certainly want to get as many people to vote as possible, but more so, it's me getting in front of those people. The first campaign I ever ran, I knocked on 13,484 doors to get elected, and I did that personally. I can't knock on as many doors as I need to this election cycle to meet all the people I need to. And so I'm going to do as much as I can, but I think that if both myself and my opponent get to the same voters, I'm going to win the majority of those voters over, and so that's my job.
There are 50 states, and therefore there are 50 state auditors. Do you know enough about other state auditors to say, wow, I like what that person is doing in that state, and I think we should do that in Ohio? And the second part to this question, so related, is there any other technology out there that somebody else is using, or not, that you know of, that you can bring on board to the auditor's job here, so you can make it faster, better, cheaper, smarter,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly one of the things that some auditors have done in other states is we've seen problems with bridges in other states where they've collapsed, and so as the chief inspector of the state, you should be looking at these sorts of infrastructure issues that could potentially cause problems to your citizens, and what's the cost to replace them, what's the cost to repair them, how are we planning for that, does it create create safety issues for the constituents you represent. So, again, I think that this office has been underutilized in many ways, and the public needs to have an understanding of what are the issues that we have and what are my elected officials doing to address those issues. And certainly if you are driving your children to school every day across a bridge that is in a position where you've got civil engineers saying, we've got real concerns about its ability to hold the passengers that are coming across this bridge on a day-to-day basis, that's concerning. What's even more concerning is nobody's even looked to assess the safety of that bridge that you're driving to school on. So you don't even know what the potential problems are. And so, again, this office has a real capacity to bring to people's attention, these are your assets, these are concerns with these assets, what are we doing to address those concerns to make sure that you and your family are safe in the community you're living in and have every opportunity to live your own American dream. And I think that a very pragmatic, thoughtful, aggressive auditor could be doing a lot more for the taxpayers, and that's just one idea of things that we could be doing.
As someone who has lots of experience now in the legislature, it's a very different kettle of fish than being an administrator, as it were.
Sure.
What lessons? What's the one or two most important lessons you've learned in the legislature that you think you can then convert to being now an administrator of an agency, where you're following laws instead of making them, and/or in your case you might be rule making as well, which rules are laws, as it were. How can your legislative experience bridge to the auditor's office?
Sure. Well, one of the things I think the current auditor has had some problems with is working cooperatively with local government officials around the state and understanding that it's a partnership, that certainly there are instances where you have people who have done things wrong, who have purposefully done things wrong, and there's a need to take an aggressive approach with respect to how you pursue that. Well, what I've seen around the state with some people who have real complaints with the current administration is, they've come out with guns blazing before they have an appreciation or understanding why things are done the way that they are. And again, I think the auditor should be working collaboratively with our local government partners and understand that before you pull your guns out and start shooting, it's probably smart to sit down and understand what they understand and then be thoughtful about how you work with them collectively, because we do have a collaborative process with the way we deliver services in this state. It's a partnership between the state and local government and federal government, and we all have a part to play in it. And if the first thing you do is start taking shots at people before you understand maybe why they have as many funds as they have and how that provides transparency to their local municipality, that creates animosity and then the inability to get things done in a way that's in the best interest of the citizens. And so, I think that I will take a much more collaborative approach with those local government officials, understanding that they're trying to follow the statute as they're required to by law, and it's my job to come in and work with them to make sure that we're providing complete transparency to the public, but also that I don't start as a prosecutor with the folks that I'm working with. And I think my opponent was a prosecutor before, and maybe that has slanted the way that he has worked with some of the folks at the local government level, but clearly that has been something that has really irked some people. And I think additionally, he's required some of the county fair boards and others to use the biggest CPA firms in the state instead of allowing them to use their local CPA firm. As any local government official knows right now, they're struggling. A bunch of their money got stolen by the state, and so they have less than ever before, and asking them to pay even more for an audit that looks pretty much the same every year if you're running a county fair board or elsewhere, and you're running on very thin margins, probably requiring them to use the most expensive accounting firm on the block isn't in their best interest. And how are we be a little bit more thoughtful about enabling them to stretch their money, especially when one of the mantras of the current office is, skinnier and more efficient. Okay, well, in some respects, you haven't allowed that. It's a nice tagline, but we need to make sure that it's not just rhetoric, that actually the policy follows the rhetoric. And so that's going to be a big push of my office is we're not just about rhetoric, we're about the substance of what we do, and we want to work with you, and we realize many of you are working very hard to deliver a service on a very small budget, and we appreciate that, and we're going to try to do all we can to help you stretch that budget.
Final two questions. Hopefully these will be the fun questions of the interview. Let's think positively, and you get elected. 4 years from now, your first term, you want people to say, what about it? You want to be remembered in your first term for Auditor Carney did.
Well, hopefully it's less about me and more about what people know then. I think that I want the public to have a better understanding of what they're getting out of their government, good and bad. And, I think there's a hue and a cry right now that government is the problem by some people. And I frankly think that there's a lot of good that government's doing, and people need to be informed about that. And then they also need to have an understanding of what are the things that are making my elected officials make choices that maybe aren't in my best interest. And I have transparency about that now. I see where resources are going to these elected officials to maybe make them make choices that aren't in my best interest. But my real hope is after 4 years, people have a greater appreciation of where's my tax money going and what am I getting for it. Because I think, every time you get paid, you look at this line that says federal taxes and state taxes, and I think a lot of people are pulling their hair out saying, what am I getting for this? And I think that the auditor should be working to make sure that, okay, well, from your pay stub, there should be an easily translatable way to go and find out, well, what am I getting for this? And how much is being generated locally, and how much is coming back to my local community, and how much is staying in Columbus? Because for all the complaints by Republicans about all the money they send to D.C. that never comes back to their state, the same complaint can be made right now about all the money coming to Columbus that doesn't come back to your local community. And, there's a lot of talk about an $8 billion hole in the state budget. Well, the last budget under Ted Strickland was $50 billion in state funds. This one's $62 billion. And so it's grown by $12 billion. And, I just don't think that the public is being dealt with in an open and transparent way, and I hope after my 4 years, all of a sudden people say, I really know what I'm getting for my state money, and I feel good about this. I don't feel so good about this, but at least I know now. And I feel like that goes a long way to start rebuilding confidence in government and the actors in government, and holding them accountable to know, ooh, if I vote for this, my voters are going to know that I took this huge contribution and I'm voting and it's benefiting this contributor. And they might question me on whether or not it was a real benefit for them as a taxpayer or a benefit just for the contributor. And I think that starts to change the way our government actors work, and hopefully gives you a government that's actually working for you instead of the other way around.
Final question. You get to ask yourself the question that you would hope a reporter would ask you, that you're dying to have asked, that you have an answer for. What question would that be?
Well, I think for me, when I ran for office initially, the idea that evidence-based ideas would create bipartisanship, I make that comment around the state now and people laugh out loud about it. And it shouldn't be laughable. We should have elected officials who are studying, who are reading, who are informing themselves, and then making choices that are in the best interest of their constituents. And this really is a step for me in the direction of making that a reality. I think the auditor, as an apportionment board officer, sits on a board that has the ability to redraw legislative lines, and frankly, I think a deal needs to be cut after this election to actually, in fact, do that. That if we wait until 2018, after the next apportionment board election, either the Democrats or the Republicans will control that board, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the citizens to have the Democrats or the Republicans control that board. I think we need a constitutional amendment that gets bipartisan support, that is about competitive legislative districts, that's about folks who get elected to office being beholden to the voters instead of beholden to a political party or to contributors. And so as soon as I am elected into this office, I will begin work on a bipartisan initiative to put on the ballot, most likely in 2016, that will amend the way that we draw those legislative districts for the State House, for the State Senate, and for the congressional districts, that will give you bipartisan districts that are in the best interest of the citizens.
John Patrick Carney, thank you for your time. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.